Today I'll be presenting the results of a language use and attitude survey that I carried out with the Fakamae language community on the island of MI in 2018. I'll begin with some introductory information on Fakamae and the language situation on MI before briefly relating the scope and methodology of my survey and its importance. And then I'll present the findings in three key areas, being speaker numbers, speaker attitudes, and domains of language use. And then using this information, I'll provide an assessment of Fakamae in terms of language vitality and endangerment status. Fakamae is one of three Polynesian outliers spoken in Vanuatu, and it's spoken on the southeastern side of the island of MI, in the villages of Makatea and Tongamea. Fakamae speakers live in close proximity with speakers of two other Vanuatu languages and are often multilingual in one or both of these languages. These include Ngakanamanga to the north and Namakura to the south, everybody on MI also speaks Bislama, the national language. There are 36 people in Makatea, 20 adults and 16 children, and 115 people in Tongamea, 61 adults and 54 children. I should note that this is very much a snapshot in time as at late 2018 because there are very high mobility levels in both of these villages. This survey took the form of informal interviews conducted in Bislama and at times moving to Fakamae, and they took place in a variety of locations such as people's homes or community meeting areas, and responses were recorded in writing via laptop at the time. The survey covered up to three areas, the first being participants' personal assessments of their personal language fluencies, along with people in their household and their parents and grandparents. The survey spoke to at least one person from each household in the Makatea and Tongamea villages to get a good overview of the two village populations. It then went on to look at participants' personal attitudes towards the languages that they speak and looking at domain-specific language use of participants. At this stage, I need to acknowledge Mary Walworth for contributing data for the first portion of this survey from 15 participants. I had the pleasure of sharing some time on MI with Mary last year, and as our survey work intersected a little, Mary kindly agreed to share this data with the permission of participants, so thank you, Mary. I should also note that not every participant completed every aspect of this survey for a number of different reasons. It's unfortunate but not entirely unexpected in the fluidity of a field environment, but when I return to MI next month, I hope to give people the opportunity to revisit it. There has been research done on Fakamae language change, particularly looking at the extensive lexical and grammatical impacts of contact with Namakura and Ngakanamanga speakers. And this was carried out by Capel in the 60s and by Ross Clark in the 80s and early 90s. But we don't know anything yet about the impact of Bislama on Fakamae, and the effects of multilingualism on Fakamae speakers hasn't been explored in great detail. So this survey attempts to fill gaps in our understanding of Fakamae's speaker base, speaker attitudes, and also its vitality. In terms of vitality, the results of the survey are applicable to a number of different indicators and factors specified by various assessment frameworks. These include speaker numbers and trends, intergenerational transmission, speaker attitudes, perceptions of a distinct identity in relation to language, and perceptions of language prestige. It also includes domains of language use in response to new domains, potential for contact with other languages, population proportion in the context of a larger group, and group dynamic in terms of critical mass. 60 participants took part in this survey, mainly from Makatea and Tongamea, with a few from some outlying areas, and this table breaks them down in terms of location, age and gender to give an idea of balance. We can see that 20 people from Makatea took part, or about 70% of the population there, 37 people in Tongamea, or about 40% of the population there, so a good chunk from both communities, and then one in Reisu, one in Botuai, and one in Janontu, so 60 altogether. 33 males were included, 27 females, and ages of participants ranged from 10 to over 70 years. Let's take a look at these participants now in terms of their L1 or main language and in terms of their Fakamae fluency level. I'll go over my method for establishing fluency in a moment. So you can see on the left that the bulk of participants speak Fakamae as an L1, about 15 or 16% speak Namakura as an L1, and on the right you'll see that the bulk of participants also possess native speaker fluency in Fakamae. You may be noticing the decimals on your left, and these account for one participant who identified as having a dual L1 of Fakamae and Namakura, so I've assigned 0.5 to each of those languages for the moment. So I've just had a look at participants, but I want to broaden this now to look at speaker numbers. But before I do this, we need to ask a couple of questions. And the first is, what is a speaker? So in the context of this survey, I've identified a speaker as somebody who has some level of productive knowledge in the language. The second question we need to ask is, where is a speaker? And I've focused for this survey primarily on Makatea and Tongamea. That is the traditional language community areas. A comprehensive survey of other areas hasn't been carried out. So the important takeaway here is that I'm not attempting to present absolute speaker numbers today, though I am working with some speakers in urban areas to get closer to this in the future. When asking participants to self-assess or assess another's language fluency, I used a 5-stage scale, beginning with no knowledge, to passive knowledge, to some productive knowledge, a good level of productive knowledge, and then native speaker fluency. And I used Bislama equivalents for each of these in the midst of interviews. Mary also used a 5-stage numerical scale, but the definitions accompanying each were slightly different to my own, so I was careful to translate that when I was incorporating the data. So here we have a breakdown of Fakamae speakers. So using self-assessments and assessments provided by participants of household members to come to these figures. So you'll see we have 33 speakers in Makatea, 102 in Tongamea, 7 in Reisu, and then a few in some other outlying areas. I don't doubt that the number of speakers in outlying areas is higher than what I've listed here. And this is simply because I haven't conducted a comprehensive survey of these areas, though I hope to return to this when I go to MI again next month. So my total here of 151 is a lot lower than Lynch and Crowley's 2001 estimate of 400. It's also lower than Tryon's 1979 estimate of 200. However, we can't say for sure at this stage whether Fakamae speaker numbers are truly dropping, because I'm not presenting absolute speaker numbers today. It's quite possible that absentee speaker numbers outnumber speakers in Makatea and Tongamea areas, because there is such a high rate of mobility and migration in these two communities. So this potentially bodes well for absolute speaker numbers, but it does potentially present its own long-term threats to Fakamae vitality. I want to spend some time looking at L1s or main languages now compared to Fakamae fluency levels. And we're looking here at Makatea and Tongamea communities combined, again using self-assessments and assessments of people's households to come to these numbers. So you'll see on the left that about 60% of the Makatea and Tongamea communities speak Fakamae as an L1. We have 19% speaking Namakura and 17% speaking Bislama. If we look to the right, we can see that there's a higher rate of people with native speaker fluency in Fakamae than there is Fakamae L1 speakers, 73% compared to 60%. And what this means is that there is a group of people who speak other L1s in these communities, but have acquired native speaker fluency nonetheless. The other thing to note here is the comparatively low number of people with non-productive knowledge. Only 7% or 10 people with passive knowledge, and only 2 people with no knowledge at all. The presence of other L1s in these two communities doesn't necessarily in and of itself bode badly for the future of Fakamae. Multilingualism is the norm on MI, so that it's quite possible that someone with a different L1 will gain some level of fluency in Fakamae. The potential impact, though, lies in a shift in critical mass and in rates of intergenerational transmission. When we compare L1s of adults and children, we see a noticeable drop in the rate of Fakamae L1, from 68% down to 51%. You can see that adults, the other interesting thing to note here is what the other L1s in these two groups comprise of. If we look at adults, the bulk of other L1s are other vernacular languages of Vanuatu, particularly Namakura at 23%. But if we look at children, the strongest L1 after Fakamae is Bislama at 35%, or over a third. There's a number of reasons for this high level of L1 in Bislama in these two communities. The first is that there's quite a number of children who are born in other areas but have come to live with extended family in Makatea and Tongamea, bringing their Bislama L1s with them. There's also a number of children who have intermarried parents where only one person speaks Fakamae as an L1, and some of these children have grown up speaking Bislama as their L1. There's also a couple of young children who are said to have dual L1s of Fakamae and Bislama. I want to look at intermarriage now as an impacting factor on intergenerational transmission. And so I can do this by comparing children of intra-married couples and children of intermarried couples. I'm limiting my scope here to couples who have children currently under the age of 18 years living in Makatea and Tongamea, and I'm only including natural or adopted children here, not children living with extended family. So we can see, looking at Makatea and Tongamea combined again, we have 8 intramarried couples, couples where both people speak Fakamae as an L1, with 20 children between them. We have 12 intermarried couples where only one person speaks Fakamae as an L1, with 25 children between them. And we also have 2 couples in Tongamea who don't share a Fakamae L1 at all, and they have 3 children. So how do these children break down in terms of L1? If we compare children of intramarried parents to children of intermarried parents, we can see first of all that the children of intramarried parents are experiencing a high rate of intergenerational transmission at 90%. But when we look at children of intermarried parents, this drops to 50%. Following Fakamae comes Bislama at 29% and Namakura at 17%. The second part of this survey involved asking participants about their attitudes towards Fakamae and towards any other language that they spoke in terms of importance, likability and usefulness. And the response from participants was very positive. In our discussions, participants often offered some additional comment to explain their responses, and when I was looking at these comments, I noticed some recurring themes which I'm presenting to you here. This chart represents comments from any participant who made them, regardless of location, and the numbers that you're looking at are instances of occurrence because some people's comments included a number of different themes. So you'll notice that the most recurring theme was that of identity, the idea of Fakamae being inherently linked to a person's sense of self. Following this, we have concern over ability. This might be a participant's concern over their own ability in terms of making mistakes or mixing too much with other languages, or concern over another's ability, particularly children in the context of potential language loss. Following this, we have the theme of place, the idea of Fakamae being inherently linked to place and in turn reflecting participants' own sense of connection to place. After this, we have secrecy, the usefulness of Fakamae to hide information from people who don't speak the language. And finally, we have uniqueness and custom. Uniqueness in terms of an awareness of the unique place that Fakamae holds amongst other languages in Vanuatu, and custom in terms of Fakamae being the language in which custom titles are given, custom knowledge is passed on, and also a customary language of respect. There was a fairly even breakdown amongst these themes in terms of age, gender, and location of participants, apart from the last two, uniqueness and custom. These are limited to older speakers of 40 years or more. The final area covered by this survey is domains of language use, and I found Landwehr's categorisation of 3 macro-level domains useful in grouping these different domains that I asked about in meaningful ways. These are home in terms of speech to different family members, cultural events in terms of domains which predate Western contact, and social events in terms of domains that have flowed on from Western contact. The responses recorded are all self-assessments made by participants. Not every participant answered every question, largely because of relevance, so these results represent only the proportion of participants who did answer. And in the interest of time today, I've grouped people's responses into 3 categories: use of Fakamae only, use of Fakamae with another language, or use of another language entirely. So let's look at the macro-level domain of home now, combining Makatea and Tongamea results. And we can see on the left the results in terms of individual domains, and on the right the overall percentage results in terms of the macro domain. So you can see that 71% of participants speak Fakamae only in the home domain, 16% speak Fakamae with another language, and 13% another language entirely. Other languages in this context are usually Bislama and Namakura. Can see that Fakamae scores very highly in the individual domains, but it's comparatively weaker in speech to grandchildren and in speech to partners. Looking at the domain of cultural events now, we have nearly the same percentage of people using Fakamae only at 72%, a high percentage of people using Fakamae with another language at 22%, Fakamae only 72%. And the domains in which Fakamae is strongest include gardening, fishing and weaving, or very traditional pastimes. The domains in which it's comparatively weaker are community meetings, community work and community meal preparation. And these are all domains in which there are potentially quite a larger number of people present, and issues of inclusion might be influencing people's language choice. Finally, looking at the domain of social events, and you'll notice that the percentage of Fakamae only use drops a lot, down to 37%. Fakamae with another language is at 28%, and another language entirely at 35%. Other languages here also include Ngakanamanga, Ngakanamanga English and French. While Fakamae scores highly in the context of church, it's important to note that this isn't the language used from the pulpit, and it doesn't include the common occurrence of rotational services. So this is only services in the village. Responses regarding schooling included current schooling or previous schooling, and you'll notice that another language entirely is used the bulk of the time. In this context, it's generally Bislama, English or French. Unfortunately, there isn't a vernacular language program in the school on MI at the moment. Fakamae only scores highly in the areas of local clubs and associations and visiting a local store. People's responses in regard to employment really depended on the place of employment, if there was any, and also the language of the employer. I don't want to go into it in too much detail now because of time, but I feel like this, along with some other domains in this area particularly, highlight the difference between intra-village communication versus inter-village communication. The fact that as soon as a Fakamae speaker steps outside their village, it generally presupposes the need for another language. There are important institutions which exist outside of the village. These include institutions of employment, of education, of healthcare and government. This isn't necessarily an issue if there's a situation of stable diglossia, but if there is a language shift in place or occurring, this could potentially add pressure to that. Finally, you'll notice that Fakamae only is weak in the newest domains of email, text messaging and Facebook. Using the information from this survey, I've applied it to a number of different assessment frameworks in terms of vitality and endangerment. So you'll see that the Language Endangerment Index has classified Fakamae as threatened. The Index of Ethno-Linguistic Vitality identifies a possible shift in progress. The GID scale is at level 6 and the expanded GID's at 6B, threatened. The UNESCO framework doesn't offer a final cumulative result, but finally Krauss does, and under his assessment, Fakamae is unstable or eroded. So you'll see a recurring theme here of threat of language shift. In conclusion, let's quickly recap the key points of this survey in relation to these assessment results. So we've seen that intergenerational transmission is strong amongst children of intramarried Fakamae speakers, but intermarried parents are half as likely to pass on Fakamae as an L1. This is a pertinent figure because intermarried couples outnumber intramarried couples. Speaker numbers are potentially lower than estimated in 2001, however absentee speakers are yet to be included. Fakamae speakers share a positive attitude towards Fakamae, and some key themes which emerged in terms of people's comments included links to identity and concerns over ability. We've seen that Fakamae is potentially used in all domains in an intra-village setting, though not by all speakers, and with a preference to home and cultural contexts. And finally, Fakamae is very limited in inter-village contexts, and it's weak in the new domains of schooling and screen-based communication. And finally, the next steps. I'm hoping to develop an estimate of absolute speaker numbers with the help of some speakers in urban areas. And I'm wanting to, alongside the results I've presented to you today, also examine contemporary language data for evidence of language shift. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. There is any question?
Mary?
Thanks, Amy. That was a really nice talk and really well put together. Just a quick question. I don't know if you've done this yet. It would probably be pretty easy to break down if you haven't. But the differences of the sort of self-reported language attitudes and language use in Makatea versus Tongamea.
Yes.
That would be really cool to see.
I really wanted to present that today, but it was at 40 minutes and I had to cut it down.
Okay,
so,
cool.
Yeah.
So you've got it. Well, you
Yeah,
can show
there's
me
a big
later.
difference.
Yep.
There's a big difference. There's a much stronger Namakura influence in Tongamea
Yep.
than in Makatea.
Yep.
But interestingly, there's a stronger Bislama influence among children in Makatea compared to
Really?
Tongamea. Although it's a smaller population,
Yeah.
you know, we're looking at. I would have really loved to present that today, but
Yeah, that's
another
okay.
time.
There's only so much time. Yeah,
Yeah.
you'll show me later.
yeah.
Thanks.
Russ.
I was. Did you say that there was very little use for email and so on?
Yes. I think only 4 people identified as using email.
That's interesting because the people in town some years ago established an email network among themselves using the language. Well, using a mix, you know, a bit of Bislama, a bit of language, and so on. And I was quite surprised by how quickly they took it up. But I think it was mainly to keep the, as you say, the what was your word for the population? The absentee
speakers.
The absentee population in touch with each other in town.
Sorry, go on.
But still, the language certainly has already been used quite a bit for that in that medium.
I know there's a Fakamae, dedicated Fakamae Facebook page, which, as you have said, it's mainly used by people in urban areas, even people living in different countries, and it's a really wonderful space, and I use it and I learn a lot from it too. A lot of it involves people who are maybe semi-speakers or heritage speakers asking questions in terms of how would I say this, or people putting up photos of this is this species of fish, this is what we call it. So it's really useful, but definitely used more by the urban population than by the people on MI, probably largely also because of the difficulty of internet on MI.
The urban people are more likely to have computers. Yeah,
that's right.
I used this as an example when I was arguing with someone a while ago who was ranting about how the internet was destroying small languages, and I said, nonsense. If you've got a way of writing your language, you can use it on the internet all you want.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, it certainly helped me in communicating with people from the community. If we're on Facebook, I can message in language, and it strengthens that in an area where it may not have beforehand. So yeah, definitely. Michael?
Thank you. I just want to ask about one of your points about intermarriage, and the intermarried couples are half as likely to teach or to speak Fakamae to their children. I'm wondering, what's the rate of intermarriage? Is it quite a high proportion of couples who are intermarried with non-speakers of Fakamae? And do you notice a pattern, whether it's the women who are married into the community or the men who marry into the community, as to what the results are, as to whether the children will speak the language or not?
I think it's changing quite a bit. I think it used to be mainly women marrying into the community, and a lot of the older women who did marry in would generally have full fluency in the language. But I think that's changing now. I have got the numbers, but I can't remember off the top of my head what the exact numbers are. But the intermarriage is definitely more common. I think now it's male or female. But I'll be interested to see, there's a couple of people who've just gotten married and moved into the village. At the moment, they don't, one has no knowledge, one has passive knowledge. And I'll be really interested to see, they've got some children coming and a couple of babies, what that looks like in the next 10 years or so.